I'm sure you had no trouble coming up with a number of important and troubling issues. We would like to direct your attention to 4 areas: political, economic, social, and cultural. Many of the issues you identified will fit in these categories. You may have identified many of the following issues. Politically, one of the biggest changes in our national life has been the tremendous increase in political contributions and lobbying activities. Some experts find that these developments have tended to focus our elected representatives on the interests of the wealthy and powerful. This chart shows the unprecedented increase in political and campaign contributions in the last 4 presidential campaigns. The total has gone from less than $500 million in 1996 to marginally shy of $2 billion in 2008. The 2 shorter bars for each year show the total directly contributed to the Republican and Democrat candidates in the final election. Contributions to the respective parties, other candidates in primaries, conventions, and other expenses comprise the total. Regardless of the impact such amounts may have on the outcome of any election, there is a concern about the way in which such money can distort the subsequent policy making and legislative process. This slide shows the huge increase in federal lobbying expenditures in the past 10 years, from $1.4 billion in 1998 to $3.5 billion in 2010, a 150% increase. More money is spent on lobbying activities than in any presidential campaign. These expenditures are focused on legislative and policy-making activities to benefit those whom lobbyists represent. Less than 1.5% of the 2010 expenditures were in the human rights category. The vast majority of lobbying activity focuses on special legislative and policy provisions for interests substantially narrower than the common good. Income inequality has become a part of our national conversation in the past year. While there are certainly different responses to this phenomenon, there is little disagreement that the gap between the top and the bottom of society in terms of income and wealth is widening at an accelerating pace. Meanwhile, the middle has been narrowing and growing more and more insecure and distrustful. This slide shows the shares of income between 1979 and 2007, a period of almost 30 years. For each income interval, the light blue bar shows the share of national income in 1979, and the dark blue column the share for 2007. For example, the bottom 20% received 2.9% of total income in 1979 and only 2.5% in 2007, and so on for each group. Each income group has seen its share fall in those 30 years, except for the top 20%. The bottom 80% have seen their share decline throughout that period from 89.5% in 1979 to 79% in 2007. Only the top 20% have seen growth increasing from 49.6% in 1979 to 59.9% in 2007. However, as this slide shows, all of that growth has occurred at the very top, the top 1%, while the share going to the 81st through the 99th percentiles has stayed essentially stable, 39.1% to 38.6%. The top 1% saw its income share increase from 10.5 to 21.3%. The bottom 99% has seen their share decline from 89.5 to only 79%. Over the past 30 years, the share of income has gone down for 99% of our fellow citizens and increased almost 2.5 times for the top 1%. This slide shows an even longer time period from 1913 to 2007. The focus is on the share of income going to the top 1% in each year. In the early part of the period, the top 1% share peaked at 23.9% in 1929, just before the economy collapsed, in part due to this lopsided distribution. Through the ensuing Depression, World War II, and the post-war boom, the share of the top 1% fell to 8.9%. The rest of the population was sharing more equitably in the growth of the national economy, and it was generally a period of prosperity. Beginning in 1980, the picture began to look eerily like the 1920s. The share of income going to the top 1% increased to 23.5%, while the shares going to the rest of the population stagnated, or for most actually declined. To a significant degree, the improvement in income equity between 1945 and 1980 and the decline in equity since 1980 have resulted from shifts in federal government policy in the areas of tax rates, economic regulation, and labor policy. For example, during most of the 1960s and 70s, working at the minimum wage kept a family of 3 out of poverty. Today, such a family is 24% below the poverty level. This slide shows yet another way of presenting the data. The chart on the left shows average household income by 20% groupings, along with the top 1%. The results are dramatic. The chart on the right displays the change in income share. The lines below the zero line are for the bottom 80%. The red line at the top shows the 130% increase in share for the top 1% since 1979. There is always the question of how much each segment should have of total income. Few would argue that the distribution should be exactly equal to share of the population. This chart shows in the top bar the actual distribution of wealth, with the top 20% holding more than 80%. The middle bar shows what Americans think the case to be, with the top 20% holding somewhat less than 60%. However, when asked what they think it should be, Americans believe that the top 20% should hold about 30% of the wealth. Since no one really expects income share to be exactly equal or proportional, what exactly is the problem? Actually, there are 3 problems. First, income-wealth inequality tends to increase the proportion of any population living in poverty, with its attendant social problems of inadequate housing, increased health risk, increased crime, and hunger. Second, extreme income inequality tends to increase the risk of speculative behavior, resulting in bubbles with the crashes that always follow. Third, and most important, income-wealth inequality negatively impacts the quality of life for everyone in society, everyone, including those at the top. This slide shows the results of research by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in their book, The Spirit Level: Why More Equal Countries Almost Always Do Better, published in 2009. Using the 10 factors shown on the left, they constructed an index of the health and social conditions in developed countries. Correlating that with measures of income equality, they produced this chart that shows an unmistakable relationship between a healthy society and greater levels of income-wealth equality. As countries move to the right on the income inequality scale along the bottom, they tend to move up in the health and social problem scale on the left. Sometimes people have a hard time picking out the United States. We are in the very top right-hand corner, the highest in inequality and predictably the highest in terms of health and social problems. In fact, this relationship, though weaker, is also present among the 50 U.S. states. While we might think that various cultural factors explain differences among countries, their analysis carefully shows such differences do not. The results within the United States makes it more likely that a more unequal society is less healthy and less safe for everyone. Interestingly, while New York is the highest in terms of income inequality, it departs significantly from the predicted line. This may reflect New York's commitment to quality of life expenditures and its constitutional commitments to citizens. Social problems of poverty, hunger, unemployment, insecurity, poor health, and homelessness are growing in the United States. While some of this is due to the immediate impact of the Great Recession of 2008, much of it is also due to long-term changes in government policy and economic structures that are producing an economy that is not meeting the needs of all citizens. Since 1979, poverty rates for total U.S. population have been stubbornly stable at around 15%. Almost 1 of every 7 inhabitants of the world's wealthiest nation lives in poverty. More disturbing is the fact that close to 1 in 5 children live in poverty. In fact, the newest methodology used by the Census Bureau indicates that 48% of the U.S. population lives in families categorized as poor or low income. The human cost of such a poverty rate is even greater than its financial cost. Although more difficult to measure, most observers agree that a popular ethic of extreme individualism elevates the individual as the first and only measure of society's health, at the expense of the well-being of the human community. A radical economic individualism proclaims that everyone benefits if each person is only concerned with pursuing his or her own self-interest. The past 30 years provide stark evidence that this is not the case. The Pontifical Council for Peace and Justice, in its recent statement on the current economic crisis, offers a strong critique of a radical individualism. The inequalities and distortions of capitalist development are often an expression not only of economic liberalism, but also of utilitarian thinking. That is, theoretical and practical approaches according to which what is useful for the individual leads to the good of the community. This saying has a core of truth, but it cannot be ignored that individual utility, even where it is legitimate, does not always favor the common good. In many cases, a spirit of solidarity is called for that transcends personal utility for the good of the community. We have looked at a lot of information, much of which has been provided to you in the study notes. This is a good time to take a break, get some refreshments, and then reconvene to discuss this question. In light of all we have seen, what are the 21st century Catholic Americans to do? Please pause the DVD.